The rusted steel groaned beneath Martha's tractor as it broke through what should have been solid earth, revealing a concrete staircase descending into darkness below. She had ploughed this same field for 37 years, but the heavy rains had shifted something deep underground. What she found would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her quiet Nebraska farm. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story grips you the way it gripped Martha, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something even more extraordinary waiting for you. Martha Henley pulled the diesel engine to a shuddering halt, her weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as she stared down. At the gaping hole her plough had just carved into the earth. The October morning mist hung low over the cornfields, creating ghostly fingers that seemed to reach toward the mysterious opening that had appeared where none should exist. She had been working this land since she was 22, back when her husband Dale was still alive, and their dreams of a prosperous farm seemed within reach. The soil here had always been reliable, predictable even. Black dirt that had fed 3 generations of Henley family crops, earth that had never once betrayed her trust or revealed any secrets. But now, staring down at concrete steps that disappeared into an impenetrable darkness, Martha felt as though the very ground beneath her feet had become a stranger. She climbed down from the tractor cab, her joints protesting the movement with the familiar ache that had become her constant companion since turning 68. The morning air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, but there was something else now, something metallic and stale that seemed to rise from the depths of the newly revealed opening. Martha had always been a practical woman. Growing up during the tail end of the Great Depression had taught her to approach mysteries with caution rather than curiosity. But this discovery defied every rational explanation she could conjure. The concrete steps were clearly man-made, professionally constructed with the kind of precision that spoke of government contractors rather than local builders. She knelt beside the opening, her knees sinking into the soft earth that had been displaced by her plough. The steps descended at a gentle angle, disappearing into darkness after just a few feet. The concrete was old, but not ancient, bearing the distinctive grey colour and smooth finish of mid-20th century construction. Along the edges, where the earth had been disturbed, she could see the remnants of what appeared to be a sophisticated waterproofing system. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't some forgotten root cellar or abandoned well. This was something far more significant, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath her family's farm for decades without their knowledge. Martha's mind raced back through the years, searching for any clue that might explain this discovery. Her father had purchased this land in 1943, returning from World War II with dreams of building an agricultural empire in the heart of Nebraska. He had never mentioned anything unusual about the property, never hinted at any structures beneath the surface. The deed was clear, the property boundaries well established, the mineral rights belonging to the Henley family in perpetuity. But now, staring into this concrete-lined passage, Martha wondered what else her family might not have known about their own land. The construction was too sophisticated for a private citizen, too permanent for a temporary structure. This had the hallmarks of a government installation, built with the kind of secrecy that characterized the early days of the Cold War. She stood slowly, her mind racing through the implications. If this was indeed a government facility, there would be protocols to follow, authorities to notify. But something deep in her gut warned her against making any hasty decisions. The federal government had not exactly been generous to farmers in recent years, and the last thing she needed was a swarm of bureaucrats descending on her property with eminent domain papers and compensation offers that wouldn't cover half of what the land was worth. Martha walked back to her farmhouse, a modest two-story structure that had sheltered 4 generations of Henleys. The house sat on a small rise that provided a commanding view of the surrounding farmland, its white clapboard siding weathered but still sturdy after 7 decades of Nebraska weather. She had lived here alone since Dale's death 5 years ago, managing the farm with the help of seasonal workers and her own stubborn determination. Inside, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn and settled into her father's old recliner. The chair faced the window that looked out over the fields, providing a direct view of the spot where her tractor still sat beside the mysterious opening. The normalcy of her morning routine felt surreal against the backdrop of her discovery. Martha had always been blessed with a practical mind, but she was also possessed of enough curiosity to recognize when something demanded investigation. She thought about calling her nephew Tommy, who lived in Omaha and worked for the state agricultural department. He would know the proper procedures for reporting such a discovery, but something held her back from reaching for the phone. Perhaps it was the memory of how the government had treated her neighbor, Frank Kowalski, when they had discovered Native American artifacts on his property 3 years ago. The archaeological survey had stretched on for months, preventing him from planting his spring crops and ultimately forcing him to sell to a development company for a fraction of what the land was worth. Frank had died the following winter, broken by the loss of the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations. Martha had no intention of suffering the same fate. This land was her legacy, her connection to Dale, and to the dreams they had shared. Whatever lay beneath the earth would have to be dealt with, but she would do so on her own terms and in her own time. She returned to the kitchen and began preparing lunch, though her appetite had vanished entirely. The routine of cooking helped calm her nerves, but her eyes kept drifting to the window and the mysterious opening that had appeared in her field. The October sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the harsh reality of her situation as she stood at the kitchen sink, washing vegetables for a salad she had no intention of eating. Martha's mind wandered to the stories her father had told about the early days of the farm. He had been a quiet man, not given to elaborate tales, but he had occasionally mentioned the unusual amount of government activity in the area during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Convoys of unmarked trucks had passed through the county roads at odd hours, and there had been rumors of secret installations being constructed throughout the Midwest. At the time, Martha had dismissed these stories as the fantasies of old men who had lived through too much history. The Cold War had been a time of paranoia and suspicion, when every unusual occurrence was attributed to communist infiltration or government conspiracy. But now, staring at the concrete steps that led into her own land, she wondered if her father's stories had contained more truth than she had ever imagined. The afternoon stretched before her, filled with the usual farm chores that needed attention. The cattle required checking, the equipment needed maintenance, and there were always repairs to be made somewhere on the property. But Martha found herself unable to concentrate on any of these familiar tasks. Her attention kept returning to the opening in the field, to the questions that multiplied with each passing hour. Who had built this installation? When had it been constructed? Why had it been hidden beneath her family's farm? And most importantly, what lay at the bottom of those concrete steps? As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Martha made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She would investigate the opening herself, alone, before involving any outside authorities. She owed it to Dale's memory, to her father's legacy, and to her own sense of justice to understand what had been hidden beneath her land. She gathered a flashlight, a length of rope, and a small toolkit from the barn. The flashlight was a heavy-duty model that Dale had purchased for emergency use during power outages. The rope was climbing grade, left over from a barn repair project. The toolkit contained the basic implements she might need for any minor obstacles she encountered. As darkness began to settle over the farm, Martha stood once again beside the opening that had appeared in her field. The concrete steps descended into blackness, but her flashlight beam revealed that the passage continued well beyond what she could see from the surface. The air that rose from the depths was cool and dry, suggesting that whatever lay below had been sealed against moisture for many years. With a deep breath that tasted of autumn and uncertainty, Martha Henley began her descent into the darkness, unaware that she was about to uncover secrets that would shake her understanding of her own history and challenge everything she believed about the quiet Nebraska farm that had been her family's home for 3 generations. The first step was solid beneath her feet, the concrete showing no signs of deterioration despite its obvious age. As she descended, her flashlight beam revealed walls that were lined with the same high-quality concrete, constructed with a precision that spoke of military specifications and unlimited budgets. This was no amateur construction project. This was something that had been built to last. Martha Henley had never imagined herself as anything other than a farmer's wife, and certainly never as a widow struggling to maintain 300 acres of Nebraska farmland entirely on her own. At 68, with arthritic hands that ached every morning and a bank account that seemed to shrink faster than her dwindling corn yields, she represented everything that was disappearing from rural America. The family farm, once the backbone of the Midwest, was becoming an endangered species, and Martha was fighting a losing battle against forces far beyond her control. She had been born Martha Louise Kowalski in 1955, the daughter of Polish immigrants who had settled in Nebraska during the post-war boom. Her father worked at the grain elevator in town. Her mother took in laundry and mending to supplement their modest income. Martha had been a bright student, earning a scholarship to the state university where she studied elementary education, with dreams of teaching in a big city, maybe Denver or Kansas City, somewhere far from the endless cornfields and small-town gossip that defined her childhood. But love had a way of reshaping even the most carefully laid plans. She met Dale Henley during her junior year at a campus dance, and everything changed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with gentle brown eyes and work-hardened hands that spoke of summers spent helping his father with the family farm. When he talked about the land, about the satisfaction of coaxing life from the soil and the peace that came with watching the seasons turn in their ancient rhythm, Martha found herself captivated by a vision she had never considered. Dale's family had owned their farm since the 1940s, when his father returned from the Pacific Theater with a head full of dreams and a modest veteran's loan that barely covered the down payment on 300 acres of prime Nebraska farmland. The elder Henley had built the operation from nothing, clearing timber, breaking sod, and slowly accumulating the equipment and livestock necessary to make a living from the earth. When Martha married Dale in 1978, she traded her teaching certificate for overalls and work boots, diving headfirst into a life she had never imagined for herself. The early years were golden, filled with the kind of simple pleasures that money couldn't buy. Summer evenings spent watching fireflies dance over the cornfields, winter mornings when the world transformed into a crystalline wonderland, spring days when the earth awakened with an almost audible sigh of relief after the long winter's sleep. They had tried for children, hoping to fill the farmhouse with the laughter and chaos that would ensure the family legacy would continue into another generation. But after 3 miscarriages and countless doctor visits that depleted their savings, they had quietly accepted that their legacy would be measured in acres preserved rather than children raised. The farm became their child, demanding constant attention and infinite patience, rewarding their devotion with harvests that varied wildly depending on weather, market prices, and the mysterious alchemy of soil and seed. The 1980s brought the farm crisis that devastated rural communities across the Midwest. Interest rates soared, land values plummeted, and farmers who had borrowed against their property during the boom years of the 1970s found themselves underwater, owing more than their land was worth. The Henleys survived by the narrowest of margins, selling off 2 parcels of their best ground and taking on additional debt that would haunt them for decades. Dale had always been an optimist, convinced that the next year would be better, that the next harvest would finally allow them to get ahead of their debts and begin building the kind of operation he had dreamed about since childhood. He embraced new technologies, invested in better equipment, and constantly experimented with different crops and farming techniques. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Martha found herself caught up in his vision of a prosperous future. But farming was an unforgiving business, subject to forces that no amount of hard work or dedication could control. Droughts devastated crops, floods washed away topsoil, and market fluctuations could wipe out a year's profits in a single day. The stress took its toll on both of them, aging them prematurely and straining their marriage in ways they had never anticipated. Dale's first heart attack came during harvest season in 2010, a mild event that the doctors assured them was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. He was only 62, still young enough to recover fully and continue farming for many more years. But the second attack, 3 years later, was massive and fatal, striking him down in the middle of their kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. In March, Martha found herself alone at 65, responsible for an operation that had always required 2 people working in partnership. She hired help during planting and harvest seasons, relying on migrant workers and neighboring farmers who were struggling with their own labor shortages. But the day-to-day management of the farm fell entirely on her shoulders, and she discovered reserves of strength and determination she had never known she possessed. The financial situation was precarious. Dale's medical bills had eaten through their savings, and the mortgage on the land still carried a substantial balance despite decades of payments. The equipment was aging and increasingly unreliable, requiring constant repairs that strained their meager resources. Martha had considered selling, but the farm represented everything she and Dale had worked for, and she couldn't bear the thought of walking away from their shared dream. The corn market had been particularly brutal in recent years, with oversupply, driving prices below the cost of production for many farmers. Martha's yields were respectable, but not spectacular, and the profit margins were so thin that a single major equipment failure or weather disaster could wipe her out entirely. She had taken on additional debt to purchase a newer tractor, a decision that kept her awake at night as she calculated and recalculated the numbers, trying to find a path forward that didn't end in bankruptcy. Her Social Security payments helped, but they weren't enough to cover both her living expenses and the costs of maintaining the farm. She'd applied for every available agricultural subsidy and conservation program, jumping through bureaucratic hoops that seemed designed more to discourage applicants than to provide meaningful assistance. The paperwork was overwhelming, the requirements constantly changing, and the payments never arrived when they were most needed. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part of her new reality. Dale had been her partner in every sense of the word, the person she shared her worries with, the one who helped her solve problems and celebrate small victories. Without him, the farmhouse felt cavernous and empty, filled with memories that could bring her to tears at unexpected moments. She had friends in town, fellow church members who invited her to potluck dinners and bridge games, but they couldn't understand the unique pressures of trying to maintain a farming operation single-handedly. Her neighbors were dealing with their own struggles. The Kowalski family had finally given up and sold their land to a development company that planned to build suburban housing on some of the most fertile soil in the county. The Hendersons had declared bankruptcy and moved to Omaha, where their Son worked at a meatpacking plant. Every month brought news of another family farm being absorbed by corporate agricultural operations or converted to non-agricultural use. Martha had watched these changes with a mixture of sadness and determination. She understood why her neighbors had made the choices they did, but she wasn't ready to surrender. The farm represented more than just a business or a piece of property. It was a connection to Dale, to his father, to a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. The tractor that had broken through the soil that October morning was a perfect metaphor for her situation. It was a reliable machine, well-maintained, but showing its age, capable of doing the job, but constantly requiring attention and repairs. She had purchased it used 15 years ago when Dale was still alive and they could justify the expense. Now it represented one of her most valuable assets and her greatest vulnerability. If it broke down completely, she didn't have the resources to replace it. She had been plowing the north field, preparing it for winter wheat planting, when the accident occurred. The ground had been unusually soft after the recent rains. Soft enough that she had considered waiting another day or two for conditions to improve. But the weather forecast called for more rain later in the week, and she needed to get the seed in the ground before the window closed entirely. The plow had been working normally, turning the soil in neat furrows that would help the field drain properly over the winter months. Martha had been thinking about her grocery list, about the prescription she needed to pick up at the pharmacy, about the heating bill that was due at the end of the month. Mundane concerns that occupied most of her mental energy these days, the countless small details that kept life moving forward one day at a time. The sudden jolt when the plow broke through had thrown her forward in the tractor seat, her hands instinctively tightening on the steering wheel as the machine lurched to a stop. Her first thought had been mechanical failure, a broken shear pin or bent coulter that would require another expensive repair. But when she climbed down to investigate, what she found defied every rational explanation she could construct. The opening in the earth was too precise to be natural, too sophisticated to be accidental. Someone had deliberately constructed this entrance, had gone to considerable trouble to hide it beneath fertile farmland, had invested significant resources in creating something that was meant to remain hidden indefinitely. The implications were staggering, and Martha found herself overwhelmed by questions that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Standing beside the mysterious opening as the October afternoon faded toward evening, Martha Henley realized that her quiet life as a struggling widow farmer was about to become something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The autumn of 2023 had already proven to be one of the most challenging seasons Martha could remember, and the discovery of the underground entrance seemed like the final weight that would crush her beneath an already unbearable load. The corn harvest had been disappointing, yielding barely enough to cover her operating expenses, let alone provide any profit for the year. Market prices remained stubbornly low, trapped in a global economic downturn that showed no signs of improvement. Her property taxes had increased by 18%, a burden that the county assessor justified by pointing to residential development in neighboring areas. The irony was bitter. Martha's farm was being taxed based on its potential value as suburban housing lots, even though zoning restrictions and her own determination kept it firmly in agricultural use. The additional $3,000 annually might seem modest to city dwellers, but for someone operating on Martha's razor-thin margins, it represented a catastrophic increase in fixed costs. The bank had been calling more frequently, their tone shifting from polite inquiries to barely. Concealed threats. Martha's loan payments were current, but just barely, and the loan officer had made it clear that any missed payment would trigger immediate action. The $47,000 she still owed on the land would normally be manageable for A productive farm operation, but with commodity prices depressed and her expenses constantly rising, the monthly payments consumed nearly half of her modest income. Her insurance premiums had doubled following a series of severe weather events across the Midwest. The insurance company claimed that climate change was making agricultural operations increasingly risky, justifying higher rates that pushed many farmers toward the difficult decision of dropping coverage entirely. Martha couldn't afford to take that risk, not when a single hailstorm or tornado could destroy everything she had worked to preserve. The equipment failures had been relentless. Her combine harvester had broken down twice during the harvest season, requiring expensive repairs that eliminated any hope of profit for the year. The irrigation system needed major updates to comply with new environmental regulations. Work that would cost more than $15,000 she didn't have. Even routine maintenance had become a constant struggle, with replacement parts increasingly expensive and difficult to obtain for her aging machinery. Labor costs had skyrocketed as agricultural workers became increasingly scarce. The young men who had traditionally provided seasonal help were leaving rural areas for better opportunities in the cities, and those who remained could command wages that made hiring them economically unfeasible for small operations like Martha's. She had been forced to do more of the physical work herself, a reality that left her exhausted and increasingly aware of her physical limitations. The regulatory environment had become a nightmare of complexity and contradictory requirements. Environmental compliance alone required dozens of hours of paperwork each month, documenting everything from pesticide applications to soil conservation measures. The penalties for violations were severe enough to bankrupt a small farmer, but the regulations were written in language so technical and convoluted that Martha often needed professional help to understand what was required of her. Her health. Insurance costs had increased to nearly $800 per month, a sum that represented a significant portion of her total income. The policy carried a deductible so high that it provided little practical protection against routine medical expenses. But going without coverage entirely would have been financial suicide at her age. She had been forced to postpone routine checkups and dental work, gambling that her health would hold out long enough for her financial situation to improve. The social isolation had intensified with each passing month. Most of her neighbors had either sold their farms or died, leaving the rural community increasingly depopulated and disconnected. The local church had closed due to declining membership, eliminating one of the few remaining social institutions that had provided support and fellowship. The grocery store in the nearest town had been purchased by a chain that cut hours and eliminated services, making even routine shopping trips more difficult and expensive. Her pickup truck was showing signs of serious mechanical problems, producing strange noises and consuming oil at an alarming rate. The repair estimate had exceeded $4,000, money she simply didn't have. Without reliable transportation, maintaining the farm would become even more challenging, but purchasing a replacement vehicle was equally impossible given her current financial constraints. The weather had been particularly uncooperative, with late spring flooding followed by a prolonged summer drought that stressed the crops during critical growth periods. The irrigation system she couldn't afford to repair had failed completely in July, forcing her to watch helplessly as sections of her corn crop withered under the blazing Nebraska sun. The economic impact had been devastating, reducing her already marginal yields by another 15%. Her nephew Tommy, who worked for the state agricultural department in Omaha, had been pressuring her to consider selling the farm to one of the large corporate agricultural operations that were consolidating small farms throughout the region. The offers were tempting from a purely financial perspective, enough to pay off her debts and provide a modest retirement income, But accepting would mean the end of everything she and Dale had built together, the final surrender of a dream that had defined their entire adult lives. The stress had begun affecting her. Sleep, leaving her exhausted during days that demanded enormous physical and mental energy. She found herself making mistakes that would have been unthinkable during her earlier years of farming, forgetting to perform routine maintenance tasks or miscalculating chemical applications. The errors were minor so far, but she worried about the potential for more serious accidents as her fatigue and anxiety continued to mount. The local bank president had suggested that she consider leasing her land to larger operations while retaining ownership, a compromise that would provide steady income without requiring her to sell. But the lease payments being offered were so low that they wouldn't cover her mortgage payments, let alone provide enough income for her to live on. The arrangement would merely delay the inevitable while stripping away her control over land that had been in the family for generations. Her medical expenses had been climbing steadily as age-related health issues required increasing attention. The prescription medications she needed for her arthritis and high blood pressure cost more than $200 per month, even with Medicare coverage. A recent diagnosis of early-stage glaucoma had added another layer of expense and worry, requiring treatments that were not fully covered by her insurance. The house itself was showing signs of deferred maintenance that she couldn't afford to address. The roof needed replacement, a project that would cost more than $20,000. The furnace was original to the house and increasingly unreliable, threatening to fail during the harsh Nebraska winter that was rapidly approaching. The electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous, but rewiring the entire house was beyond her financial means. Her internet service, essential for managing the modern paperwork requirements of farming, had become increasingly unreliable, as the rural provider struggled with outdated infrastructure. The service interruptions made it difficult to submit required reports on time, threatening her eligibility for various agricultural programs that provided crucial support for her operation. Now, standing beside the mysterious opening that her tractor had revealed, Martha felt as though the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. Just when her situation seemed as challenging as it could possibly become, she had stumbled upon a discovery that threatened to complicate her life in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. If this was indeed a government installation, as the professional construction suggested, its presence on her property could trigger investigations, legal proceedings, and regulatory scrutiny that would make her current problems seem trivial by comparison. The timing couldn't have been worse. She was already operating at the absolute limit of her financial and emotional resources, barely managing to keep the farm afloat from one season to the next. The discovery of classified military installations would almost certainly attract the attention of federal authorities who had the power to condemn her property, freeze her assets, or impose restrictions that would make farming impossible. She thought about Frank Kowalski's experience with the archaeological survey that had ultimately destroyed his farming operation. The government had claimed the right to study his property for months, preventing him from planting crops during crucial seasons and ultimately forcing him into bankruptcy. The compensation he received had been a fraction of his actual losses, and the legal battles had consumed what little savings he had managed to accumulate over decades of hard work. Martha's situation was even more precarious than Frank's had been. She had no financial reserves to sustain her through months of government investigation, no alternative income sources to fall back on if her farming activities were restricted. The discovery in her field could very well represent the final blow that would force her to abandon everything she had fought so hard to preserve. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, reminding her that time was running out in more ways than one. The wheat needed to be planted soon if she hoped to have any income at all the following year. The equipment needed winterization. The livestock required additional feed supplies and countless other seasonal tasks demanded attention. She couldn't afford to spend days or weeks dealing with government bureaucrats and their endless questions about installations that had been built without her knowledge or consent. As darkness settled over the Nebraska farmland, Martha realized that her discovery had transformed her from a struggling farmer into a woman standing at the center of a mystery that could either destroy her remaining hopes or somehow provide the salvation she desperately needed. Martha descended the concrete steps with growing trepidation, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that revealed the unmistakable precision of military construction. The air grew cooler with each step downward, carrying a metallic taste that spoke of decades of isolation from the world above. 23 steps brought her to a heavy steel door, painted in the dull green that had been standard for government installations during the Cold War era. The door stood slightly ajar, its massive hinges showing signs of recent movement despite the thick layer of dust that covered everything else. Beyond the door lay a corridor that stretched further than her flashlight could illuminate, lined with additional doors on both sides. The floor was polished concrete, still bearing the faint outlines of painted safety stripes that had once guided personnel through these underground passages. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling in neat parallel lines, connected to junction boxes every 20 feet with the methodical precision that characterized military engineering projects. Martha pushed through the first door and found herself in what appeared to be a communications center. Banks of equipment lined the walls, much of it unfamiliar but clearly sophisticated for its era. Radio equipment, teletype machines, and early computer terminals filled the room, all connected by cables that had been routed with obsessive attention to organization and efficiency. Dust sheets covered most of the equipment, but several items remained exposed, as if someone had been working here recently. The next room contained filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, each drawer labeled with codes that meant nothing to Martha but suggested a complex organizational system. She pulled open the first drawer and found herself staring at hundreds of manila folders, each marked with classification stamps that made her heart race. Top secret, classified, eyes only. The stamps were repeated across every document she could see, marking information that was clearly never intended for civilian eyes. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the first file marked Operation. Deep Watch, Phase I Implementation. The documents inside were dense with technical jargon and military terminology, but certain phrases jumped out at her with startling clarity. References to Soviet missile capability, first strike scenarios, and civilian population protection painted a picture of preparations for nuclear war that had been conducted beneath her family's farm without their knowledge or consent. The scope of the installation became clear as she explored room after room of equipment and documentation. This wasn't simply a communications facility or emergency shelter. It was a full-scale command center designed to coordinate military responses during a nuclear attack. Maps covered the walls of one room, showing missile trajectories, fallout, patterns, and evacuation routes for major population centers throughout the Midwest. Another room contained what appeared to be a complete duplicate of the North American Aerospace Defense Command's early warning systems. In a room marked Personnel Quarters, Martha found evidence that this facility had been regularly occupied. Bunks lined the walls, each with personal lockers that still contained clothing, toiletries, and personal effects from the 1960s and 1970s. A kitchen area featured industrial-grade equipment capable of feeding dozens of people for extended periods. Emergency supplies filled an adjacent storage room. Canned goods, medical supplies, and radiation detection equipment stacked to the ceiling. The most disturbing discovery came in a room labeled contingency planning. Here, she found detailed studies of nuclear attack scenarios specific to Nebraska and surrounding states. The documents described which cities would be primary targets, how radioactive fallout would spread across agricultural areas, and what percentage of the population could be expected to survive various levels of nuclear exchange. Her own farm appeared on several of the maps, marked as a potential evacuation center due to its isolation and agricultural resources. Martha sank into a chair that had been placed before a wall of monitors, now dark and silent, but clearly once connected to surveillance systems throughout the region. The implications of what she was discovering crashed over her like a physical blow. For decades, while she and Dale had worked their land and built their life together, military personnel had been conducting secret operations beneath their feet, preparing for a war that would have destroyed everything they loved. The documents she examined revealed that the facility had been constructed in 1961, during the height of Cold War tensions following the Bay of Pigs invasion and the construction of the Berlin Wall. The installation was designated as Deep Watch Station Nebraska 7, one of dozens of similar facilities scattered across the American heartland. Its mission was to serve as a backup command center for strategic air command operations, capable of coordinating nuclear responses if primary military installations were destroyed. The construction had been conducted under the cover of agricultural improvement projects, with contractors told they were building advanced grain storage facilities for the Department of Agriculture. The work had been completed in sections over a 3-year period, with different crews handling different phases, to prevent anyone from understanding the true scope of the project. The landowners had been told that subsurface mineral surveys were being conducted, explaining the presence of drilling equipment and earth-moving machinery. Personnel assignments showed that the facility had been staffed around the clock during periods of heightened international tension, with teams of specialists rotating through the installation on schedules coordinated with military bases throughout the region. The records indicated that the last regular staffing had ended in 1989, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent reduction in nuclear tensions between the superpowers. But more recent documents suggested that the facility had not been completely abandoned. Maintenance records showed regular inspections and equipment updates continuing through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Someone had been keeping the installation operational long after the official end of the Cold War, updating systems and maintaining readiness for scenarios that apparently still concerned military planners. Martha found herself particularly disturbed by a series of reports labeled civilian population studies. These documents contained detailed profiles of local residents, including herself and Dale. The military had been monitoring their activities, tracking their routines, and assessing their potential usefulness in various emergency scenarios. Dale's mechanical skills had been noted, along with Martha's teaching background and their farming expertise. They had been classified as essential personnel for post-attack reconstruction efforts. The surveillance had been more extensive than she could have imagined. Photographs in the files showed their farm from various angles, taken with telephoto lenses that captured intimate details of their daily activities. Reports documented their financial situation, their health status, their relationships with neighbors, and their political opinions based on overheard conversations and intercepted mail. The violation of privacy was so complete and systematic that Martha felt physically ill as she read through the accumulated records. One particularly chilling document outlined procedures for civilian asset requisition during national emergencies. The military had developed detailed plans for taking control of private farms throughout the region, converting them into food production centers under military supervision. The document specified that existing farmers would be retained as technical advisors, but would have no ownership rights or decision-making authority over their own land. Equipment inventories revealed the sophisticated nature of the installation's capabilities. In addition to communications gear and computing equipment, the facility contained emergency power generators, water purification systems, and air filtration units designed to operate for months without outside support. A medical facility was equipped to handle everything from routine care to emergency surgery, staffed by military medical personnel during periods of activation. The psychological impact of her discoveries was overwhelming. Martha had always taken pride in the independence and self-reliance that farming required, but now she learned that her entire adult life had been conducted under the watchful eyes of military observers who had been prepared to strip away that independence at a moment's notice. Every decision she and Dale had made, every plan they had developed, had been monitored and evaluated by strangers who saw them as resources to be managed rather than people deserving of dignity and privacy. As she sat surrounded by decades of classified documents, Martha realized that her financial troubles and the threat of losing her farm might be the least of her concerns. The installation beneath her land represented secrets that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect. Her accidental discovery had placed her in possession of information that could embarrass government officials, reveal uncomfortable truths about military preparedness, and expose surveillance activities that had been conducted without congressional oversight or public knowledge. The weight of this realization settled over her like a physical burden. She was no longer simply a struggling farmer facing bankruptcy and isolation. She had become the guardian of state secrets that someone somewhere would be very interested in keeping buried. The question was whether that someone would see her as a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated. The silence of the underground facility pressed against her consciousness, broken only by the distant hum of machinery that continued to operate decades after its original purpose had supposedly ended. Martha understood with growing clarity that her discovery had transformed her from a victim of circumstances into something far more dangerous. A witness to activities that were never supposed to be witnessed, holding evidence of preparations for a war that would have ended civilization as she knew it. The sound of footsteps echoing through the underground corridor froze Martha's blood in her veins. She had been so absorbed in reading through the classified documents that she hadn't heard anyone approaching until the steady rhythm of boots on concrete became unmistakable. Her flashlight beam wavered as her hands began to shake, and she quickly switched it off, plunging herself into the absolute darkness of the buried facility while her mind raced through impossible scenarios of who might be walking through these supposedly abandoned tunnels. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the softer sound of voices engaged in quiet conversation. Martha pressed herself against the wall of filing cabinets, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her location. Through the darkness, she could see the faint glow of approaching flashlights, their beams dancing across the walls as the unseen visitors made their way deeper into the facility. "The breach occurred in Section 7, came a voice, deep and authoritative, with the unmistakable cadence of military training. "Looks like the farmer's tractor went right through the concealment layer. 43 years of careful camouflage, and some old woman with a plow brings it all down. Any indication she's been down here?" asked a second voice, younger but equally professional. "Unknown at this point. We need to conduct a full assessment before determining next steps. If she's discovered the classified material, we've got a significant containment problem." Martha's hands clenched into fists as she realized these men were discussing her as if she were already a problem to be solved rather than a person with rights and dignity. The casual tone in which they discussed containment sent chills down her spine, bringing to mind all the stories she had heard about government agents who made inconvenient witnesses disappear without a trace. "Sergeant Rodriguez should be here within the hour," the first voice continued. "He's bringing the full assessment team from Offit. We'll know exactly what we're dealing with once they've had a chance to review the scene." What about the farmer? Martha Henley, according to the property records, 68 years old, widow, no children, lives alone on the property. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, our priority is determining the extent of the compromise and implementing appropriate countermeasures. The casual discussion of her personal information and their clinical assessment of her situation filled Martha with a rage that overcame her fear. These men had been monitoring her, collecting information about her private life, and were now discussing her fate as if she were nothing more than a logistical problem to be managed. The violation felt even more intimate than the surveillance record she had discovered earlier. As the voices and footsteps moved deeper into the facility, Martha forced herself to remain absolutely still until the sounds faded into the distance. Only then did she risk turning her flashlight back on, keeping the beam low and pointed away from the areas where the men had gone. She needed to get out of the underground facility immediately, but she also realized that simply fleeing would leave her defenseless against whatever actions these government agents might take. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered several of the most damaging documents she had discovered, stuffing them into her jacket pockets, along with a selection of photographs that clearly showed the extent of surveillance conducted on her property. If these men were prepared to contain her to protect their secrets, she needed evidence that could serve as insurance against whatever they might be planning. The journey back to the surface felt like the longest walk of her life. Every shadow could conceal a waiting agent. Every sound might herald the approach of people who saw her as a threat to national security. When she finally emerged from the concrete stairway into the cool October night, Martha felt as though she had escaped from prison, but she knew her freedom might be temporary, rather than returning directly to her farmhouse, where government agents might already be waiting. Martha made her way to the old barn that sat on the far side of her property. The building had been constructed by Dale's father in the 1950s, and served as storage for equipment and supplies that weren't used regularly. More importantly, it offered a vantage point from which she could observe her house and the access road. Without being seen, from the barn's second-story loft, Martha could see several vehicles parked near her farmhouse that hadn't been there when she began her underground exploration. Black SUVs with government license plates sat in her driveway, like predators waiting for prey to return to its den. Through her binoculars, she could make out figures moving around her property with the systematic efficiency of people conducting a professional search operation. The sight of strangers going through her home, her private space, filled Martha with a fury that burned away her fear and replaced it with steely determination. These people had been violating her privacy for decades, and now they were treating her as if she were the criminal. The injustice of the situation crystallized her resolve to fight back against forces that clearly saw her as expendable. As she watched the government agents systematically search her property, Martha's mind turned to the one person who might be able to help her navigate this impossible situation. Colonel William "Bill" Morrison had been Dale's closest friend during his brief service in the Army National Guard, and he had remained a family friend throughout the years following their discharge. More importantly, Bill had spent his career in military intelligence before retiring to a small farm about 50 miles away. If anyone could help her understand what she had stumbled into and how to protect herself from the consequences, it would be Bill Morrison. He had always been a man of absolute integrity, someone who believed that the military existed to protect citizens rather than to manipulate them for political purposes. During their many conversations over the years, he had expressed growing concern about the expansion of government surveillance and the erosion of constitutional protections in the name of national security. Martha knew that contacting Bill would require leaving her property, which meant evading the government agents who were clearly waiting for her return. But she also understood that staying hidden in the barn would only delay an inevitable confrontation that she was not equipped to handle alone. She needed an ally who understood the system she was fighting against, someone with the knowledge and connections necessary to protect her from people who had the power to make her disappear. The documents in her jacket pockets felt like both a burden and a lifeline. They contained evidence of surveillance activities and military preparations that had been conducted without public knowledge or oversight, information that could embarrass powerful people and expose uncomfortable truths about government operations during the Cold War. But they also made her a target for people who had demonstrated their willingness to violate her rights and privacy to protect their secrets. As midnight approached, Martha made her decision. She would have to leave her property and seek help from the one person who might be able to level the playing field between herself and the government agents who were hunting her. The risk of being caught was enormous, but the alternative of surrendering to people who saw her as nothing more than a security threat was unacceptable. She gathered the emergency supplies she kept in the barn, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a first aid kit, and the hunting rifle that Dale had used. For deer season, the rifle might not be much protection against professional government agents, but it was better than facing them completely defenseless. She also collected several jerry cans of gasoline, knowing that her truck would need fuel for the journey. To Bill Morrison's farm, the escape from her own property required all the stealth and patience she could muster. Martha waited until the government agents appeared to be focused on searching her house, then made her way through the cornfields toward the county road, where she had hidden her truck behind an abandoned grain elevator. The corn provided excellent cover, but walking through the dried stalks in darkness was treacherous, requiring her to move slowly to avoid making noise that might alert the watchers. When she finally reached her truck, Martha discovered that her hands were shaking so badly she could barely start the engine. The reality of what she was doing, fleeing from government agents while carrying stolen classified documents, struck her with full force. She was a 68-year-old widow who had never broken a law more serious than a speeding ticket, and now she was engaged in activities that could be classified as espionage or treason. But as she drove through the empty Nebraska countryside, toward Bill Morrison's farm, Martha reminded herself that she hadn't chosen this fight. The government had chosen to build their secret installation beneath her family's land, had chosen to conduct surveillance on her private life, and had chosen to treat her as a threat rather than as a citizen deserving of protection and respect. If they wanted to make her into an enemy of the state, she would show them exactly how formidable an enemy a determined farm woman could become. The classified documents rustled in her jacket as she drove through the night, carrying secrets that powerful people had killed to protect in the past and would undoubtedly kill to protect in the future. But Martha Henley was no longer the frightened widow who had accidentally broken through the soil that morning. She was a woman who had discovered the true face of the government she had trusted throughout her life, and she was prepared to fight for the truth, no matter what the cost might be. The headlights of Martha's pickup truck cut through the pre-dawn darkness as she navigated the winding gravel roads that led to Bill Morrison's farm. She had deliberately chosen the most indirect route possible, taking back roads and farm lanes that wouldn't appear on any government GPS tracking system. Her paranoia felt justified given what she had discovered about the extent of surveillance. that had been conducted on her own property for decades. Bill Morrison's farm sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills that provided natural concealment from casual observation. The two-story farmhouse was dark, except for a single light in what Martha knew to be Bill's study, where he often stayed up late reading military history books and working on his memoirs. She parked her truck behind the barn, out of sight from the main road, and made her way carefully across the yard toward the house. Her knock on the back door was soft but insistent, the kind of sound that would wake a light sleeper without alerting anyone who might be watching from a distance. After several minutes, she heard footsteps approaching, and the porch light came on. Bill Morrison appeared in the doorway wearing a bathrobe over his pajamas, his grey hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes immediately alert with the wariness of a man who had spent decades in military intelligence. "Martha, what in God's name are you doing here at 4 a.m? His voice carried concern rather than irritation as he took in her mud-stained clothes and the obvious distress written across her face. "I need your help, Bill. I've stumbled into something that's way over my head, and I don't know who else to trust." Martha's voice cracked with exhaustion and stress as she spoke, and Bill immediately stepped aside to let her into the warmth of his kitchen. Without being asked, Bill poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was perpetually brewing on his stove and guided Martha to the kitchen table. He had always been perceptive about people's emotional states, a skill that had served him well during his intelligence career, and he could see that Martha was operating on the edge of complete breakdown. "Tell me what's happened," he said simply, settling into the chair across from her and giving her his complete attention. Martha began with the discovery in her field, describing how her tractor had broken through the concealment layer above the underground installation. As she spoke, she watched Bill's expression change from concern to professional interest, his military training automatically analyzing the information she was providing. When she described the classified documents and the evidence of surveillance, his face hardened with an anger that she had rarely seen from the normally calm retired colonel. "Show me," Bill said when she finished her initial account. Martha pulled the documents from her jacket pockets, spreading them across the kitchen table under the bright overhead light. Bill examined each piece of paper with the methodical attention of someone trained to extract maximum information from intelligence materials. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, after reading through the surveillance reports that documented Martha and Dale's private activities. "This is completely illegal. Domestic surveillance of civilians without warrants, infiltration of private property, preparation for martial law implementation. This violates about 6 different constitutional amendments." He looked up at Martha with an expression that combined professional respect with personal outrage. "You've uncovered something that people have been killed for discovering. The fact that you're sitting here alive suggests that they either don't know you've been in the facility or they're planning something more subtle than simple elimination." Martha described her encounter with the government agents in the underground facility, repeating their conversation as accurately as she could remember. Bill's expression grew increasingly grim as she related their casual discussion of containment procedures and their clinical assessment of her personal situation. "Those weren't regular military personnel," Bill said after she finished. "That kind of talk, that level of operational security, suggests either CIA or NSA contractors, probably part of a cleanup crew tasked with maintaining plausible deniability for operations that were never officially authorized." He stood and began pacing around the kitchen, his mind clearly working through the implications of what Martha had discovered. "The installation you described sounds like one of the deep watch facilities that were constructed during the early 1960s. Most of them were supposedly decommissioned after the Cold War ended, but I always suspected that some remained operational for contingency purposes." Bill explained that during his intelligence career, he had heard rumors about a network of secret command centers scattered throughout the American heartland, designed to coordinate government and military responses during nuclear attacks. The facilities were built without congressional oversight or public knowledge, funded through black budget operations that left no official records of their existence. The problem is that these installations were never just about nuclear war, Bill continued, settling back into his chair and leaning forward intently. They were designed to maintain government control during any kind of national emergency: natural disasters, economic collapse, civil unrest, foreign invasion. The surveillance capabilities you discovered were probably intended to identify potential resistance leaders during martial law scenarios. Martha felt her blood chill as she realized the full scope of what had been planned beneath her family's farm. You're saying they were preparing to turn America into a police state. I'm saying they were preparing for that possibility, Bill corrected. The people who built these facilities believed they were protecting democracy by creating the capability to suspend it temporarily during extreme emergencies. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. He picked up one of the surveillance photographs that showed Martha and Dale working in their garden, completely unaware that they were being watched by government agents with telephoto lenses. But this goes way beyond emergency preparedness. This is systematic violation of civil liberties, conducted against American citizens who pose no threat to national security. Bill's analysis confirmed Martha's worst fears about the people who were now hunting her. These weren't patriotic government employees acting within the bounds of law and constitution. They were part of a shadow apparatus that had been operating outside legal constraints for decades, accountable to no one except the hidden power structure that had created them. "What are my options?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Bill was silent for several minutes, clearly weighing various possibilities in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the dangerous waters of government intelligence operations. "Officially, you have no options. If you go to local law enforcement, they'll either dismiss your story as the fantasies of a crazy old woman, or they'll contact federal authorities who will make you disappear. If you go to the media, they'll either ignore you or they'll be pressured to suppress the story. If you contact your congressman, he'll refer the matter to the appropriate federal agencies, which will put you right back in the hands of the people who are hunting you." Martha felt her hope draining away as Bill methodically eliminated each possible avenue of assistance. "So I'm completely helpless against them." "I didn't say that," Bill replied, his voice taking on a steely quality that reminded Martha of the military officer he had once been. "I said your official options are limited, but there are unofficial channels. People who believe that the Constitution still means something, even when the government chooses to ignore it." He explained that during his intelligence career, he had built relationships with journalists, congressional staffers, and retired military officers who shared his concerns about the expansion of government surveillance and the erosion of civil liberties. Many of these people now worked in positions where they could provide assistance to citizens who found themselves targeted by illegal government operations. "The key is documentation," Bill continued, tapping the classified papers that Martha had brought. "These documents prove that illegal surveillance was conducted against American citizens. They provide evidence of preparations for martial law that were never authorized by Congress or disclosed to the public. Most importantly, they show a pattern of constitutional violations that goes back decades." Bill proposed a strategy that would protect Martha while simultaneously exposing the illegal activities she had discovered. Rather than confronting the government agents directly, they would work through back channels to build a coalition of support among people who had the power to investigate and prosecute constitutional violations. "We need to get copies of these Documents to multiple people simultaneously, Bill explained. Journalists who specialize in government accountability, congressional staffers who work on intelligence oversight, retired military officers who still have connections in the Pentagon. If we can create enough pressure from multiple directions, it becomes much harder for them to simply make the problem disappear. Martha listened to Bill's plan with growing hope, but also with awareness of the enormous risks involved. They would be taking on people who had demonstrated their willingness to violate laws and constitutional rights to protect their secrets. The government agents who had been searching her property wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to prevent exposure of their operations. "I need to be completely honest with you, Martha," Bill said as he finished outlining his strategy. "These people play for keeps. Once we start this process, there's no going back. They'll view both of us as threats to national security, which means we'll be operating outside the protection of normal legal processes." Martha thought about the casual way the government agents had discussed her containment, about the decades of surveillance that had been conducted without her knowledge or consent, about the preparations for martial law that had been made using her property without her permission. The choice between fighting back and submitting to people who saw her as expendable wasn't really a choice at all. "What do we do first?" she asked, and Bill Morrison smiled for the first time since her arrival, recognizing the steel beneath her frightened exterior that had enabled her to survive decades of farming in an unforgiving environment. Within hours of Martha's arrival at Bill Morrison's farm, the scope of the threat they faced became devastatingly clear. Bill had barely finished outlining his initial strategy when his secure landline began ringing with an insistence that made both of them freeze in recognition of its ominous implications. The caller identification showed a number that Bill recognized. Immediately, his former commanding officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man who had been retired for over a decade and had no official reason to be contacting anyone at 5:30 in the morning. "Bill, we need to talk," came the voice of General Marcus Webb, his tone carrying the kind of urgency that military personnel learned to recognize as a prelude to serious trouble. "There's been a significant security breach in your area, and certain parties are very interested in ensuring that any civilian involvement is handled with appropriate discretion." The coded language was unmistakable to someone with Bill's background. Webb was warning him that Martha's discovery had already been reported up the chain of command, and that official pressure was being applied to ensure the situation was resolved quietly. The fact that Webb was making the call personally, rather than sending subordinates, indicated that the matter had reached the highest levels of the intelligence community. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Marcus," Bill replied carefully, knowing that the conversation was almost certainly being recorded. "I'm just a retired farmer these days, not much involved in security matters." "Cut the bullshit, Bill. We know the Henley woman contacted you, and we know she's in possession of classified materials that could compromise ongoing operations. This isn't about ancient history. Some of those programs are still active, and exposure could cost lives." The admission that classified programs from the Cold War era remained operational confirmed Bill's worst suspicions about the installation beneath Martha's farm. These weren't simply historical curiosities being preserved for academic interest. They represented active intelligence operations that were still being conducted without public knowledge or congressional oversight. Martha listened to the conversation with growing alarm, realizing that her decision to seek help from Bill had inadvertently expanded the scope of the threat to include someone she had hoped could protect her. The government's intelligence apparatus was far more extensive and sophisticated than she had imagined, capable of tracking her movements and monitoring her communications in real time. "The woman is a 68-year-old farmer, Marcus," Bill continued, his voice betraying none of the tension Martha could see in his posture. "She's not a foreign agent or a terrorist. She's an American citizen who accidentally discovered something on her own property." "That's exactly the problem," Webb responded, his tone hardening noticeably. "She's a civilian with no security clearance and no understanding of the implications of what she's found. The materials in her possession could be used by foreign intelligence services to compromise national security." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Webb applying increasing pressure for Bill to cooperate with efforts to contain the security breach. The general made it clear that Martha's options were limited to full cooperation with government investigators or facing federal charges for possession of classified materials. The implication was that her accidental discovery would be treated as intentional espionage if she refused to surrender the documents quietly. When Bill finally ended the call, his expression was grim with the recognition of how quickly their situation had deteriorated. "They're not just monitoring your property anymore, Martha. They've been tracking your movements since you left the farm last night. They know you're here, they know about the documents you took, and they're prepared to use federal anti-terrorism laws to justify pretty much anything they want to do." The revelation that she had been under surveillance during her escape from the farm struck Martha like a physical blow. Her careful efforts to avoid detection, her indirect route through back roads, her attempt to hide her truck behind Bill's barn, all of it had been useless against technology and resources she couldn't even comprehend. "How is that possible?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. The surveillance capabilities documented in the files she had discovered were clearly far more sophisticated than she had realized. Bill explained that modern intelligence agencies possess tracking capabilities that made traditional evasion techniques obsolete. Satellite surveillance, cellular phone monitoring, license plate recognition systems, and facial identification technology created a web of observation that was virtually impossible for ordinary citizens to escape. They don't need to follow you physically when they can track your truck's GPS system, monitor your cell phone's location data, and use satellite imagery to observe your movements from space," Bill said grimly. "The infrastructure for comprehensive surveillance of American citizens has been in place for years, supposedly for counter-terrorism purposes, but it's clearly being used for domestic intelligence operations as well. The scope of the surveillance state that had developed around them without their knowledge or consent was overwhelming in its implications." Martha realized that her entire adult life had been conducted under the observation of people who had the power to monitor her most private activities and make decisions about her fate based on information she never knew they possessed. But the immediate threat came not from abstract surveillance capabilities, but from the very concrete reality that government agents were preparing to take direct action against her. Bill's phone conversation had made it clear that official pressure was being applied at the highest levels to resolve the situation quickly and quietly, which meant that Martha's window of opportunity for fighting back was rapidly closing. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Bill said, moving to his computer and beginning to compose messages to his network of contacts. "If we're going to get these documents to people who can use them, we need to do it before they move against us. Directly." The next several hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as Bill worked his connections throughout the intelligence community, the media, and Congress. Martha watched with growing amazement as her retired farmer neighbor revealed himself to be at the center of an informal network of people who shared concerns about government overreach and constitutional violations. His first call went to Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist at the Washington Post who specialized in intelligence community oversight. Chen had built her reputation by exposing illegal surveillance programs and constitutional violations by government agencies, earning her both Pulitzer Prize recognition and a place on various government watch lists. Sarah I'm sending you something. That's going to blow your mind, Bill said during their encrypted phone conversation. Cold War surveillance program that's apparently still active. Complete documentation of illegal domestic spying. Evidence of martial law preparations that were never authorized by Congress. Jen's response was immediate and professional. She would need multiple sources to verify the authenticity of the documents, protection for any whistleblowers involved, and legal coverage from her newspaper's attorneys before proceeding with publication. But the potential story was explosive enough that she was willing to work around the clock to develop it properly. Bill's second call went to Rebecca Martinez, a staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union, who had been fighting government surveillance programs in federal court for over a decade. Martinez specialized in constitutional challenges to intelligence operations, and she immediately recognized the significance of what Martha had discovered. If these documents are authentic, they represent the most significant evidence of systematic constitutional violations that we've seen since the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, Martinez told Bill during their conversation. We're talking about decades of illegal surveillance, preparation for martial law, violation of property rights. This could be the foundation for a class action lawsuit that fundamentally changes the relationship between citizens and the intelligence community. The third critical contact was Congressman James Harrison, a member of the House Intelligence Committee who had been pushing for greater oversight of classified programs. Harrison's chief of staff, Michael Torres, had worked with Bill on previous whistleblower cases and understood the political implications of exposing ongoing intelligence operations. The timing is actually perfect, Torres explained during their secure phone conversation. The committee has been investigating reports of domestic surveillance programs that weren't properly authorized by Congress. These documents could provide the evidence we need to force a full investigation and potentially criminal prosecutions. As Bill worked his network of contacts, Martha found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined. That of a whistleblower whose evidence could expose decades of government wrongdoing. The classified documents that had seemed like a burden when she first discovered them were now recognized as potentially the most significant intelligence leak since Edward Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance programs. But with recognition of the documents' importance came an escalation of the threats they faced. Bill's secure phone began receiving calls from government officials at increasingly high levels, each conversation more threatening than the last. The pressure being applied was clearly coordinated and systematic, designed to isolate them from potential allies and force their surrender through a combination of legal threats and social pressure. The most disturbing call came from someone who identified himself only as Mr. Smith and claimed to represent interested parties within the intelligence community. Smith's message was delivered in the calm, professional tone that made its content even more chilling than explicit threats would have been. Colonel Morrison, you're a patriotic American who served his country with distinction, Smith said during their brief conversation. I'm sure you understand that certain national security matters must be handled with appropriate discretion, regardless of how they might appear to civilians who lack the proper context to understand their significance. The implied threat was unmistakable. Martha and Bill were being given an opportunity to cooperate quietly, but that opportunity would not remain available indefinitely. The alternative to cooperation was not simply legal prosecution, but the kind of permanent solution that left no witnesses to testify about uncomfortable truths. As the morning progressed and the pressure intensified, Martha realized that her accidental discovery had transformed her from a struggling farmer into a person whose survival depended on successfully challenging some of the most powerful and ruthless people in the American government. The stakes could not have been higher, and the odds could not have been longer. But Martha Henley had not survived decades of farming in harsh Nebraska conditions by surrendering when times grew difficult. She had learned to fight for what was hers, to protect what mattered most, and to find strength in the darkest moments. Now, with classified documents spread across Bill Morrison's kitchen table and government agents closing in from all directions, she prepared to fight the most important battle of her life. The moral crossroads that confronted Martha Henley arrived with the kind of stark clarity that strips away all pretense and forces a human being to confront their deepest values. By noon on that October day, Bill Morrison's secure communications network had delivered an ultimatum that crystallized the impossible choice she faced. The message came through General Webb, but its true authors remained hidden behind layers of bureaucratic anonymity that characterized the shadow apparatus she had inadvertently challenged. Mrs. Henley has 24 hours to return all classified materials and submit to a comprehensive debriefing, Webb informed Bill during their final official conversation. In exchange, she will be relocated to a secure facility where she can live comfortably under government protection for the remainder of her natural life. The alternative is federal prosecution for espionage, which carries a mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. The offer was presented as generous, even compassionate. Martha would be provided with excellent medical care, comfortable accommodations, and access to recreational activities appropriate for someone of her age and background. She would be allowed to correspond with approved family members under supervised conditions, and her financial needs would be met by a government pension that exceeded anything she could earn from farming. The only price for this comfortable captivity would be her silence, her freedom, and her complicity in covering up decades of constitutional violations that had been conducted against American citizens without their knowledge or consent. She would disappear from the world she had known, becoming another casualty in the government's ongoing war against transparency and accountability. Bill studied Martha's face as he relayed the ultimatum, watching for any sign that she might be tempted by what many people in her situation would consider a reasonable compromise. The offer addressed her most pressing concerns: financial security, medical care, protection from the government agents who were hunting her. All she had to do was abandon her principles and accept that ordinary citizens had no right to hold the government accountable for illegal activities. "What about you, Bill?" Martha asked when he finished explaining the terms of surrender. "What happens to you if I accept their offer?" Bill's smile held no humor, only the grim recognition of someone who had spent decades observing how the intelligence community dealt with inconvenient witnesses. "I'll probably suffer a tragic accident within the next few weeks. Heart attack, car crash, hunting mishap. Something appropriately random that won't raise too many questions among people who knew me." The casual way he discussed his own probable execution drove home the reality of what they were fighting against. These weren't government employees operating within legal constraints, accountable to democratic institutions and constitutional protections. They were part of a parallel power structure that recognized no authority beyond its own perceived necessities, no moral boundaries beyond operational requirements. Martha walked to the window that looked out over Bill's farm, seeing the peaceful, rural landscape that had defined her entire adult life. The rolling hills and open fields represented everything she had worked to preserve, the continuity of American agricultural traditions that connected her generation to the pioneers who had first broken this prairie soil. But beneath that peaceful surface lay the infrastructure of surveillance and control that had been imposed without the knowledge or consent of the people who lived here. The documents spread across Bill's kitchen table told a story that went far beyond her personal situation. They revealed systematic violations of constitutional rights that had been conducted against thousands of American citizens over multiple decades. The surveillance programs, the preparation for martial law, the plans for seizing private property during declared emergencies, all of it represented a betrayal of the democratic principles that supposedly distinguished America from the totalitarian systems it had fought throughout the Cold War. "How many other people are there like me?" Martha asked, still gazing out the window. "How many other families have been living their lives under government surveillance without knowing it?" Bill had been researching that exact question throughout the morning, using his intelligence contacts to gather information about the scope of the surveillance programs documented in Martha's files. The answer was staggering in its implications for American democracy. Based on the operational parameters described in these documents, probably several million citizens were subjected to some level of surveillance over the past 60 years. Bill replied, "Farmers, teachers, small business owners, community leaders, anyone who possessed skills or resources that might be useful during national emergencies." The program was designed to create a comprehensive database of American civilians who could be monitored, controlled, or eliminated depending on the government's perceived needs. The revelation that millions of Americans had been secretly classified as potential threats to be managed by their own government struck Martha as a fundamental violation of everything the country claimed to represent. The Constitution promised that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, but how could that consent be meaningful when the government was conducting secret programs that treated citizens as enemies to be controlled rather than people to be served? She thought about Dale, about their decades of marriage and their shared dreams of building something lasting on their Nebraska farm. They had believed they were living as free Americans, making their own choices and pursuing their own vision of happiness. But the surveillance files revealed that their entire adult lives had been observed and analyzed by government agents who saw them as resources to be managed rather than people deserving of dignity and privacy. The personal violation was profound, but Martha found herself equally troubled by the broader implications of what she had discovered. If the government could conduct decades of illegal surveillance against law-abiding citizens, if it could prepare for martial law without congressional authorization, if it could seize private property during declared emergencies, then the constitutional protections that supposedly safeguarded individual liberty were nothing more than pieces of paper that could be ignored whenever convenient. What happens to democracy if we let them get away with this? Martha asked, turning back to face Bill across the kitchen table. What happens to the next generation if we teach them that constitutional rights don't matter when the government decides they're inconvenient? Bill had been pondering the same question throughout his decades-long career in military intelligence. He had watched the gradual erosion of constitutional protections in the name of national security, the expansion of surveillance powers that were never subjected to meaningful oversight, the development of a shadow government that operated beyond democratic accountability. "Democracy dies when good people choose safety over freedom," Bill replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Every generation faces the choice between preserving liberty and accepting comfortable slavery. Most people choose comfort, which is why freedom is always one generation away from extinction." Martha understood that her decision would be about more than her own fate. It would be about whether ordinary Americans still possess the courage to hold their government accountable for constitutional violations, whether the principles of democratic governance retained any meaning in an age of unlimited surveillance and unchecked executive power. The pressure being applied against her was designed to make resistance seem hopeless, to convince her that fighting back would only result in her destruction while changing nothing about the system she was challenging. But Martha had learned during her decades of farming that the most important battles were often the ones that seemed impossible to win, that victory sometimes required accepting enormous personal costs for the sake of principles that transcended individual survival. She thought about the young people she had taught during her brief career as an educator, about the faith they had placed in her to prepare them for citizenship in a democratic society. What lesson would her surrender teach them about the relationship between citizens and government? What example would her silence set for future generations who would inherit the surveillance state she was choosing not to challenge? The classified documents on Bill's table represented more than evidence of government wrongdoing. They were a test of whether Americans still possessed the civic courage that had created their democratic institutions and sustained them through previous crises. The choice between personal safety and public accountability would define not only Martha's character, but the character of the nation she claimed to love. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Bill's farm, Martha realized that her decision had been made not through rational calculation of costs and benefits, but through recognition of who she was and what she stood for. She was Dale Henley's widow, the daughter of Polish immigrants who had sought freedom in America, a woman who had spent her life working land that represented the promise of democratic opportunity. She could not trade that heritage for the comfortable captivity that the government was offering. She could not teach future generations that constitutional rights were privileges to be surrendered whenever the powerful found them inconvenient. She could not betray the memory of everyone who had fought and died to preserve the freedoms that were now being offered as bargaining chips in a negotiation she had never asked to join. "I won't take their deal," Martha said finally, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "Whatever happens next, I won't be the person who chose silence over truth, safety over freedom. If they want to destroy me for telling the truth about what they've done, that's a choice they'll have to live with." Bill Morrison nodded, with the satisfaction of someone who had recognized the steel beneath Martha's frightened exterior from their first conversation. The battle ahead would be brutal, and victory was far from certain, but they would face it with their integrity intact and their principles uncompromised. The war for American democracy was about to begin in earnest. Martha's declaration of defiance against the government's ultimatum set in motion a cascade of events that would test every relationship, every alliance, and every assumption about power in America that she had ever held. Within hours of her decision to reject the offer of comfortable captivity, Bill Morrison's secure communication network began delivering responses from the contacts he had reached throughout the morning, and the scope of support for their fight began to reveal itself in ways that surprised even the veteran intelligence officer. Sarah Chen from the Washington Post was the first to provide concrete assistance, arriving at Bill's farm in an unmarked rental car with a team of technical specialists, who immediately began the process of authenticating the classified documents. Chen had spent the intervening hours consulting with her editors, her newspaper's legal team, and intelligence community sources who could verify the significance of Martha's discovery. "These documents are authentic," Chen announced after her team completed their preliminary analysis. The paper, the typefaces, the classification stamps, the bureaucratic language, everything checks out as genuine Cold War-era intelligence materials. More importantly, we've confirmed that several of the surveillance programs described in these files are still operational under different names and authorities. The revelation that decades-old surveillance programs remained active under contemporary legal frameworks provided the news hook that Chen needed to justify front-page coverage of Martha's story. This wasn't simply historical curiosity about government overreach during the Cold War. It was an ongoing constitutional crisis that affected millions of Americans who remained unaware of how extensively their government was monitoring their private lives. But Chen's support came with requirements that forced Martha to confront the personal cost of her decision to fight back. Publication of the story would require Martha to go on the record with her identity, her personal history, and detailed accounts of her discovery. There would be no anonymity, no protection from the government retaliation that would inevitably follow exposure of their illegal activities. Once this story breaks, you become a public figure whether you want to or not, Chen explained to Martha as they sat around Bill's kitchen table reviewing the documents. The government will try to destroy your credibility by attacking your character, your mental stability, your motives for coming forward. They'll dig into every aspect of your personal life, looking for ammunition to discredit your testimony. Martha had already witnessed how the government treated people who threatened their secrets. The casual discussion of her containment by the agents in the underground facility had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Going public would provide some protection against being quietly disappeared, but it would also make her a target for more sophisticated forms of retaliation. Rebecca Martinez from the American Civil Liberties Union arrived at the farm shortly after Chen, bringing with her a team of constitutional lawyers who had been preparing legal challenges to government surveillance programs for years. Martinez immediately recognized that Martha's documents provided the evidence they needed to file the most comprehensive lawsuit against domestic surveillance operations in American history. We're talking about a class action suit that could include millions of Americans who were subjected to illegal surveillance without their knowledge or consent, Martinez explained to Martha and Bill. Your documents prove systematic violations of the Fourth Amendment that continued for decades under multiple presidential administrations. This could be the case that finally forces meaningful oversight of intelligence community operations. But legal victory would require Martha to serve as the primary plaintiff in a lawsuit that would consume years of her life and subject her to intense scrutiny from government lawyers who specialized in destroying whistleblowers. The litigation process would be brutal, expensive, and uncertain, with no guarantee that the courts would ultimately rule in favor of constitutional protections over claimed national security interests. The most unexpected support came from within. The intelligence community itself, as Bill's network of contacts, began providing information that revealed the extent of internal opposition to the surveillance programs Martha had discovered. Congressman Harrison's chief of staff, Michael Torres, delivered the most encouraging news during a secure phone conversation that afternoon. You've lit a fuse under decades of accumulated frustration within the intelligence committees, Torres told Bill. We've had members of Congress asking questions about domestic surveillance programs for years, but they've been stonewalled by claims of national security and executive privilege. Your documents provide the evidence we need to force accountability. Torres explained that several members of both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees had been growing increasingly concerned about surveillance programs that operated without meaningful congressional oversight. Martha's evidence would provide the foundation for hearings that could expose the full scope of unconstitutional intelligence activities and potentially lead to criminal prosecutions of officials who had authorized illegal operations. But congressional support would require Martha to testify publicly about her discoveries, subjecting herself to hostile questioning from committee members who prioritized intelligence community secrecy over constitutional protections. The hearing process would be televised, making her face and story known to everyone in the country, including government agents who might prefer to resolve the situation through more direct methods. As the afternoon progressed and the scope of potential support became clear, Martha found herself confronting the reality that her decision to fight back would transform her from a private citizen into a public symbol of resistance against government overreach. Every news interview, every legal deposition, every congressional hearing would require her to relive the trauma of discovering that her government had been treating her as an enemy for decades. The personal cost of resistance was driven home. When Bill received a phone call from Martha's nephew Tommy, who worked for the state agricultural department in Omaha. Tommy's voice carried panic and confusion as he described a visit from federal agents who had appeared at his office that morning, with questions about his aunt's mental stability and potential involvement with anti-government extremist groups. "They're saying you've been making wild claims about secret government installations and stolen classified documents," Tommy told Martha when Bill put the call on speaker. "They showed me photographs of you meeting with people they described as known intelligence assets and domestic terrorism suspects." "Aunt Martha, what the hell is going on?" The government strategy for discrediting Martha was already in motion, using her own family members to question her credibility and sanity. Tommy had been told that his aunt was suffering from age-related mental decline that made her susceptible to manipulation by anti-government conspiracy theorists who were using her for their own radical political purposes. Martha felt her heart break as she listened to the confusion and concern in Tommy's voice. He was a good man who had always respected her strength and independence, but the government's disinformation campaign was clearly effective in planting seeds of doubt about her mental competence and motivations. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Martha said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. "Everything I've told you is true. I found a secret government installation beneath our farm, and I have documents that prove illegal surveillance has been conducted against our family for decades. The people who visited you today are trying to discredit me because I'm threatening to expose their criminal activities." The silence that followed her explanation was filled with the weight of family relationships stretched to their breaking point by forces beyond their control. Tommy wanted to believe her, but the agents who had visited him were professional and persuasive, armed with official credentials and detailed information about Martha's recent activities. Similar calls began coming in throughout the afternoon, from other family members, friends, and neighbors who had been contacted by government agents seeking information about Martha's character, mental state, and recent behavior. The systematic campaign to isolate her from her support network was both sophisticated and ruthless, designed to leave her feeling alone and vulnerable, just as she was being asked to take on the most powerful institutions in American government. But for every relationship that was damaged by the government's disinformation campaign, new alliances emerged from unexpected quarters. Bill's phone began receiving calls from retired military officers, former intelligence analysts, investigative journalists, and civil liberties attorneys who had been waiting for years for evidence that could support challenges to unconstitutional surveillance programs. The most significant call came from Colonel James Fletcher, a retired Air Force intelligence officer who had spent his career working on classified programs similar to the one Martha had discovered. Fletcher's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed government wrongdoing from the inside and had been searching for an opportunity to expose it. "Mrs. Henley, what you've found is just the tip of the iceberg," Fletcher told her during their secure phone conversation. The Deep Watch program was one of dozens of classified operations that violated constitutional protections in the name of national security. If you're willing to fight this battle, there are hundreds of people within the intelligence community who are ready to support you with additional evidence and testimony. Fletcher explained that a network of current and former intelligence professionals had been documenting constitutional violations for years, waiting for the right moment and the right case to challenge the system from within. Martha's accidental discovery had provided the catalyst they needed to transform decades of accumulated evidence into a coordinated assault on the surveillance state that had grown beyond all democratic accountability. As evening approached and the scope of potential support became clear, Martha realized that her decision to fight back had initiated something far larger than a personal battle for justice. She had become the focal point for a movement that sought to restore constitutional governance to a nation that had gradually surrendered its freedoms to unaccountable intelligence agencies operating in the shadows of democracy. The battle ahead would test every aspect of her character and potentially cost her everything she had worked to preserve throughout her life. But Martha Henley had made her choice, and she would face whatever consequences followed with the determination that had sustained her through decades of farming in the harsh Nebraska landscape. The war for American democracy had found its unlikely champion in a 68-year-old widow whose only crime had been plowing her field on an October morning when the earth chose to reveal its buried secrets. 6 months after Martha Henley's tractor broke through the concealment layer, above Deepwatch Station, Nebraska 7, she stood before the United States Senate Intelligence Committee in a hearing room packed with journalists, civil liberties advocates, and intelligence community officials whose faces reflected various degrees of concern, anger, and resignation. The woman who had once struggled to pay her property taxes had become the central figure in the most significant intelligence oversight hearing since the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s. The transformation in Martha's circumstances had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. The Washington Post's front-page story about her discovery had triggered an avalanche of revelations about domestic surveillance programs that violated constitutional protections for decades. Sarah Chen's meticulous reporting, supported by the classified documents Martha had retrieved from the underground installation, had exposed a network of secret facilities scattered throughout the American heartland, each conducting surveillance operations against law-abiding citizens without warrants or judicial oversight. The legal battlefield had proven equally transformative. Rebecca Martinez and her team at the American Civil Liberties Union had filed a class action lawsuit that now included over 2 million Americans who had been subjected to illegal surveillance under various classified programs dating back to the early Cold War. Federal courts in 3 circuits had ruled that the surveillance activities documented in Martha's files violated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, establishing legal precedents that would reshape intelligence community operations for generations. But the most profound changes had occurred in Martha's personal life, as her decision to fight back against government overreach had connected her with a community of people who shared her commitment to constitutional principles and democratic accountability. The isolation that had defined her widowhood had been replaced by relationships with journalists, lawyers, retired intelligence officers, and congressional staffers who had welcomed her into their ongoing battle for transparency and civil liberties. Bill Morrison had become more than a neighbor and advisor. He had emerged as Martha's closest friend and confidant, someone who understood both the personal costs and the historical significance of her decision to resist. Their relationship had evolved from mutual support during a crisis to something deeper and more lasting, built on shared values and complementary strengths that had sustained them through months of legal battles and government retaliation. Teacher, farm that had once represented Martha's burden, had been transformed into something resembling a command center for constitutional resistance. The old farmhouse now housed a secure communications facility that connected Martha with supporters throughout the country, while the barn had been converted into a document storage and analysis center where teams of researchers continued to examine the implications of the classified materials she had discovered. Financial security, which had seemed impossible just months earlier, was no longer a concern. The book deal for Martha's memoir had provided enough money to pay off her debts and fund legal challenges for years to come. Speaking fees from universities, civil liberties organizations, and professional associations had created a steady income stream that exceeded anything she had earned from farming. Most importantly, a documentary film about her story was generating revenue that would support the ongoing legal battles and investigative journalism needed to fully expose the surveillance state she had stumbled upon. The underground installation that had started everything remained a subject of intense interest and controversy. Congressional investigators had conducted extensive examinations of the facility, documenting the scope of surveillance equipment and classified operations that had been conducted beneath Martha's farm for decades. The installation had been officially decommissioned, but similar facilities throughout the country remained operational under legal authorities that Congress was now working to reform. Martha's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee represented the culmination of months of preparation and coordination with legal teams, congressional staffers, and intelligence community whistleblowers who had provided additional evidence of constitutional violations. Her appearance was being broadcast live on multiple television networks and streaming platforms, making her words available to millions of Americans who were learning for the first time about the extent of domestic surveillance conducted by their own government. Chairman Russell, members of the committee, Martha began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment and the television cameras that were broadcasting her words around the world. 6 months ago, I was a struggling farmer who had never given much thought to intelligence operations or constitutional law. Today, I stand before you as someone who has learned firsthand how our government has been violating the rights of American citizens for decades, conducting surveillance operations that would make the East German Stasi proud. Her testimony methodically documented the evidence she had discovered from the classified files that revealed systematic surveillance of law-abiding citizens to the communications equipment that had been used to monitor private conversations without warrants. She described the government agents who had discussed her containment as if she were an enemy combatant rather than an American citizen, and the pressure that had been applied to force her silence about constitutional violations. But Martha's most powerful testimony focused on the broader implications of what she had discovered for American democracy. The documents I found beneath my farm prove that our government has been preparing for decades to suspend constitutional protections whenever officials decide that circumstances require it. They have identified millions of American citizens as potential threats to be monitored, controlled, or eliminated based on their skills, resources, or political opinions. The committee's response to Martha's testimony reflected the political divisions that characterized contemporary American governance. Democratic members praised her courage in exposing constitutional violations and called for comprehensive reforms to intelligence community oversight. Republican members questioned her motives, suggested that her discoveries had compromised national security, and implied that foreign adversaries might be using her testimony to damage American intelligence capabilities. But the most significant response came from Senator Patricia Hawkins, the ranking minority member who had initially been skeptical of Martha's claims. Hawkins had spent weeks reviewing the classified evidence in secure facilities, consulting with intelligence community officials, and conducting her own investigation of the surveillance programs that Martha had exposed. Mrs. Henley, Senator, Hawkins said during her questioning period, I want to apologize to you on behalf of the United States government for the violations of your constitutional rights that have been documented through your brave decision to come forward. The evidence you have provided proves systematic abuse of power that continued for decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Hawkins announced that she would be introducing bipartisan legislation to reform intelligence community oversight establish stronger protections for whistleblowers, and create independent monitoring of domestic surveillance programs. The proposed legislation would also provide compensation for Americans who had been subjected to illegal surveillance, and establish criminal penalties for intelligence officials who violated constitutional protections. The hearing concluded with Martha's response to a question about whether she regretted her decision to fight back against the government's attempts to silence her. Her answer summarized the journey that had transformed her from a struggling widow into a symbol of resistance against government overreach. Senator, 6 months ago, I was facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything my husband and I had worked to build together. I thought my biggest problem was making my mortgage payments and keeping my equipment running for another season. I had no idea that my government had been treating me as a potential enemy for decades, monitoring my private life and preparing to seize my property whenever they decided it was necessary. Martha paused, looking around the hearing room at the faces of journalists, activists, and government officials who were witnessing this moment of democratic accountability. What I've learned through this experience is that freedom isn't something we inherit from previous generations and then get to keep without effort. Every generation has to fight for constitutional protections against people who believe that security is more important than liberty, that efficiency is more valuable than due process, that the ends justify the means regardless of what those means do to the character of our democracy. The conclusion of the Senate hearing marked not an ending, but a transformation in Martha's role from whistleblower to advocate for constitutional governance. The Martha Henley Foundation, established with proceeds from her book and speaking engagements, had become a leading voice for intelligence community reform and civil liberties protection. The foundation provided legal support for other whistleblowers, funded investigative journalism into government surveillance programs, and educated Americans about their constitutional rights. Martha's farm had been preserved as both her home and a symbol of resistance against government overreach. Visitors came from around the world to see the place where an accidental discovery had triggered one of the most significant challenges to the surveillance state in American history. The underground installation had been converted into a museum that documented the history of domestic surveillance programs and their impact on constitutional governance. The personal relationships that had sustained Martha through her battle with the government had evolved into something approaching an extended family of people committed to preserving democratic institutions. Bill Morrison had become her partner in both the legal fight and in life. Their shared experience creating a bond that transcended their original crisis. Together, they had built something that neither could have achieved alone, a legacy of resistance that would inspire future generations to hold their government accountable to constitutional principles. As autumn returned to Nebraska and Martha stood once again in the field where her journey had begun, she reflected on the distance she had traveled from the frightened widow who had accidentally broken through the earth's surface to reveal buried secrets. The tractor that had started everything still sat in her barn, a reminder that sometimes the most significant changes in history begin with ordinary people doing ordinary work who happen to be in the right place when the truth decides to reveal itself. The fight for constitutional governance would continue long after Martha's generation passed from the scene, but she had helped establish that ordinary Americans still possess the power to hold their government accountable when they found the courage to stand up for principles that transcended personal safety and comfort. In a nation where cynicism about democratic institutions had become commonplace, Martha Henley had proven that individual citizens could still make a difference when they chose truth over silence, courage over comfort, and freedom over security. The seeds of democratic renewal that had been planted in a Nebraska cornfield would continue to grow, nurtured by people who understood that liberty requires eternal vigilance and that the price of freedom is the willingness to fight for it when fighting seems impossible and victory appears beyond reach. The autumn light filtered through the windows of Martha's farmhouse as she sat at the kitchen table that had become the nerve center of a movement she never intended to create. 2 years had passed since her tractor first broke through the concealment layer above the underground installation, and the ripple effects of that discovery continued to reshape American politics in ways that surprised even the most experienced observers of government accountability movements. The Morning Mail brought correspondence from supporters around the world who had been inspired by her story to challenge their own government surveillance overreach. Letters arrived from farmers in Australia who had discovered military installations on their properties, from teachers in Germany who had uncovered evidence of illegal domestic spying programs, and from retirees in Canada who were fighting government. Attempts to classify them as security threats based on their political activities. Martha had become an unwitting symbol of resistance against the surveillance state that had emerged in democratic countries throughout the world following the September 11th attacks. Her story had demonstrated that ordinary citizens possessed the power to challenge even the most secretive government programs when they found the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal costs involved. The transformation in her daily routine reflected the scope of responsibilities she had never sought but could not abandon. Conference calls with investigative journalists occupied her mornings, as reporters from major news organizations continued to develop stories based on the classified documents she had discovered. Legal strategy sessions with civil liberties attorneys filled her afternoons, as the class action lawsuit against government surveillance programs expanded to include new plaintiffs and additional constitutional violations. But it was the evening hours that brought the most profound satisfaction, when Martha worked with high school and college students who visited her farm to learn about constitutional governance and civic responsibility. These young people arrived with questions about their digital privacy, their government's surveillance capabilities, and their own power to influence democratic institutions that seemed increasingly distant from ordinary citizens' concerns. "Mrs. Henley," asked Jennifer Morrison, a senior at the University of Nebraska who was writing her honors thesis on government surveillance programs, "how do we know when our government has crossed the line from legitimate security measures to unconstitutional oppression?" The question reflected the fundamental challenge facing Martha's generation and all those who would follow them: how to maintain the balance between security and freedom that democratic societies required. The classified documents from the underground installation had revealed decades of gradual erosion in constitutional protections, each violation justified by circumstances that seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively represented a transformation of American governance. "The line gets crossed one small step at a time," Martha replied, pouring coffee for the students gathered around her kitchen table. "Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to destroy the Constitution. Instead, well-meaning people make reasonable compromises during crisis situations, and those compromises become permanent policies that expand during the next crisis." She explained how the surveillance programs documented in her discovery had begun during the legitimate fears of nuclear war that characterized the early Cold War period. Military planners had created contingency plans for maintaining government operations during national emergencies, including surveillance of citizens who might resist martial law or emergency restrictions on civil liberties. The problem is that once you create the infrastructure for surveillance and control, it doesn't get dismantled when the original crisis passes, Martha continued. Instead, new justifications are found for maintaining the programs, and they gradually expand to cover more situations and more people until ordinary citizens are treated as potential threats to be monitored rather than people to be served. The students took notes as Martha described how the Deep Watch installation beneath her farm had evolved from a nuclear attack command center to a comprehensive domestic surveillance facility that monitored American citizens based on their political opinions, their economic resources, and their potential usefulness during various emergency scenarios. "So how do we prevent that from happening again?" asked David Chen, Jennifer's classmate, who was studying constitutional law. "How do we maintain security without sacrificing the freedoms that make security worthwhile?" Martha's answer drew on 2 years of intensive education in constitutional law, intelligence community operations, and the history of democratic governance that her battle with the surveillance state had required. She had been forced to become an expert in subjects she had never studied, learning from the lawyers, journalists, and former intelligence officers who had supported her fight for accountability. "Eternal vigilance," she replied, using the phrase that had become central to her public speaking. "Every generation has to actively defend constitutional protections against people who believe that efficiency is more important than due process, that security justifies any violation of individual rights, that the government knows better than citizens what's good for them." The conversation continued for hours, covering topics that ranged from digital privacy rights to congressional oversight of intelligence operations. Martha found these discussions with young people to be among the most rewarding aspects of her transformed life, offering hope that future generations would be better prepared to defend democratic institutions than her own had been. The phone call that interrupted their discussion brought news that demonstrated how Martha's individual act of resistance had inspired similar courage in others. Zara Chen from the Washington Post was calling with information about a new whistleblower who had come forward with evidence of surveillance programs that had been established after Martha's revelations forced the official termination of the Deep Watch network. "They've created new programs with different names and different legal authorities," Chen explained during their encrypted phone conversation. "Same surveillance capabilities, same constitutional violations, but structured to avoid the specific legal challenges that your case established. We need to meet with this new source, but they'll only talk if you're present to verify their security." The revelation that government surveillance had continued despite congressional hearings, legal victories, and public outcry was disappointing but not surprising to Martha. She had learned that the intelligence community possessed remarkable resilience and creativity when it came to maintaining their capabilities, despite democratic oversight efforts. "Where and when?" Martha asked, already mentally preparing for another round of legal battles and media exposure that would consume months of her life and subject her to renewed government retaliation. The meeting was arranged for the following week in Washington, D.C., where Martha would once again find herself at the center of a national debate about the proper balance between security and freedom in a democratic society. The new whistleblower, identified only as Cardinal in Chen's reporting, possessed evidence of surveillance programs that had been expanded to include social media monitoring, financial transaction analysis, and behavioral prediction algorithms that assessed citizens' likelihood of engaging in anti-government activities. As Martha prepared for her trip to Washington, she reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that October morning when her plow had broken through the earth. To reveal buried secrets, the struggling widow who had faced bankruptcy and isolation had been replaced by a nationally recognized advocate for constitutional governance, whose opinions were sought by congressional committees, news organizations, and civil liberties groups throughout the country. But the personal costs of her transformation remained significant and ongoing. The government's retaliation had been systematic and sophisticated, designed to punish her for exposing their constitutional violations while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. Her medical insurance had been mysteriously cancelled, forcing her to pay enormous premiums for coverage through high-risk pools. Her farm's property tax assessment had been increased to levels that would have been financially devastating without the income from her book and speaking engagements. Most painfully, several family relationships had never recovered from the government's disinformation campaign that had portrayed Martha as mentally unstable and susceptible to manipulation by anti-government extremists. Her nephew Tommy still maintained polite but distant contact, clearly uncertain about whether his aunt was a heroic whistleblower or a delusional old woman who had been exploited by political radicals. The isolation that had characterized her widowhood had been replaced by a different kind of loneliness, the burden of carrying knowledge about government wrongdoing that most Americans preferred to ignore or deny. Even people who supported her cause often seemed uncomfortable with the implications of what she had discovered, preferring to believe that the surveillance state she had exposed was an aberration rather than a fundamental characteristic of contemporary American governance. But Martha had also discovered relationships and sources of meaning that more than compensated for what she had lost. Her partnership with Bill Morrison had evolved into a deep companionship based on shared values and mutual respect that sustained them both through the ongoing challenges of their fight for accountability. Their work together had created something that neither could have achieved alone, a legacy of resistance that would inspire future generations to defend constitutional protections against those who would sacrifice freedom for the illusion of security. The Martha Henley Foundation had grown into one of the most effective civil liberties organizations in the country, providing legal support for whistleblowers, funding investigative journalism into government surveillance programs, and educating Americans about their constitutional rights. The Foundation's annual budget now exceeded $2 million, supported by donations from individuals who had been inspired by Martha's courage to contribute to the ongoing fight for democratic governance. The underground installation that had started everything had been transformed into a museum and educational center that attracted visitors from around the world. School groups, college classes, and international delegations came to learn about the history of domestic surveillance in America and its impact on democratic institutions. The facility served as a tangible reminder that constitutional protections required active defense by citizens who were willing to challenge government overreach, regardless of the personal costs involved. As Martha prepared to leave for Washington to meet with the new whistleblower, she understood that her journey was far from over. The battle for constitutional governance was not a single victory that could be achieved and then preserved without effort. It was an ongoing struggle that would require vigilance, courage, and sacrifice from every generation of Americans who valued freedom more than security, truth more than comfort, and democratic principles more than authoritarian efficiency. Standing once again in the field where her accidental discovery had changed the course of her life, Martha felt the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge of how fragile democratic institutions truly were. But she also felt the strength that came from knowing that ordinary citizens still possessed the power to hold their government accountable when they found the courage to stand up for principles that transcended personal safety and convenience. Washington meeting with the whistleblower known as Cardinal took place in a secure facility beneath the Smithsonian Institution, arranged through channels that Bill Morrison's intelligence contacts had developed over decades of covert operations. Martha found herself face-to-face with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former NSA analyst whose conscience had finally overcome her oath of secrecy when she discovered that the surveillance programs Martha had exposed had been replaced by something far more sophisticated and invasive. They call it Prism Next, Dr. Vasquez explained, her hands trembling as she spread classified documents across the conference table. It's not just surveillance anymore, it's predictive behavioral modification. The system can identify citizens who are likely to resist government policies before they even know they disagree with them, then manipulate their information environment to change their opinions or neutralize their influence. The revelation sent chills through Martha's spine as she realized that her 2-year battle against government surveillance had only scratched the surface of how extensively democratic processes were being manipulated by intelligence agencies operating without oversight or accountability. The new system didn't simply watch citizens, it actively shaped their thoughts and behaviors through algorithmic control of social media feeds, news recommendations, and even targeted advertising. Sarah Chen's investigation into Prism Next would eventually expose how artificial intelligence had been weaponized against American democracy itself, but Martha understood that this discovery represented only the latest chapter in an ongoing struggle that would define the future of constitutional governance. Each victory against government overreach seemed to trigger the development of more sophisticated methods of control, as if the surveillance state possessed an immune system that adapted to overcome democratic resistance. 3 months later, Martha stood before the largest crowd she had ever addressed. Over 50,000 people gathered on the National Mall for what organizers called the March for Digital Democracy. The demonstration had been sparked by revelations about Prism Next, but it had evolved into something larger, a national awakening to the reality that traditional concepts of privacy, freedom of thought, and democratic participation were being systematically undermined by technologies that most Americans barely understood. "My friends," Martha began, her voice carried across the crowd by speakers that had been arranged throughout the mall. 2.5 years ago, I was just a farmer trying to plant winter wheat before the weather turned. I thought my biggest problem was making ends meet on a family farm that had been struggling for years. I had no idea that my government had been treating me as a potential enemy since before I was born. The crowd responded with a roar of recognition and anger that reflected the growing awareness among ordinary Americans that their democratic institutions had been captured by unaccountable intelligence agencies that served corporate and political interests rather than constitutional principles. "But what I've learned through this journey is that we are not powerless," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Every person in this crowd represents the power of citizenship that our founders envisioned when they created a government that derives its authority from the consent of the governed. When we stand together, when we demand accountability, when we refuse to trade our freedom for the illusion of security, we can still reclaim our democracy from those who have stolen it." The march culminated with the announcement of the Constitutional Restoration Amendment, a comprehensive reform proposal that would establish digital privacy as a fundamental right, require congressional approval for all domestic surveillance programs, and create independent oversight of intelligence community operations. Martha had become one of the leading advocates for the amendment, which had already gained support from over 200 members of Congress and was being considered by state legislatures throughout the country. As the crowd began to disperse, Martha was approached by a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, accompanied by her parents who had driven from Iowa to attend the march. The girl handed Martha a handwritten letter that would later become one of her most treasured possessions. "Dear Mrs. Henley," the letter read, "My name is Sophie, and I'm in 6th grade. My parents told me about how you stood up to the government. When they were doing bad things to regular people, I want to be like you when I grow up. Not a farmer, but someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth even when powerful people don't want to hear it. Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference." That evening, as Martha sat in her hotel room overlooking the monuments that symbolized America's founding principles, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a struggling widow into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The personal costs had been enormous. The isolation, the retaliation, the constant stress of legal battles and media scrutiny. But the rewards had been even greater. The knowledge that her courage had inspired others to defend their own freedom, that her sacrifice had contributed to awakening a generation of Americans to the threats facing their democracy. The phone. Call from Bill Morrison brought news that seemed to complete the circle of her transformation. Tommy, her nephew, who had been estranged since the government's disinformation campaign, had finally reached out with an apology and a request to visit the farm to learn more about what Martha had discovered. "He's been doing his own research," Bill explained. "Reading the court documents, studying the congressional testimony, talking to other people who've been targeted by surveillance programs. He wants to help with the Foundation's work. Maybe even testify about how the government tried to turn family members against you." Martha felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as she realized that even the most painful consequences of her decision to fight back were beginning to heal. The government's attempt to isolate her from her family had ultimately failed, just as their efforts to silence her had transformed her into a more powerful voice for accountability than they could have imagined. 6 months later, Martha stood, once again in the field where her journey had begun, but this time she was not alone. Students from universities across the country had come to participate in the first annual Constitutional Democracy Workshop, learning about surveillance oversight, digital privacy rights, and the practical skills of democratic resistance. The old farmhouse buzzed with activity as young people prepared to return to their communities as advocates for constitutional governance. The Martha Henley Foundation had announced its most ambitious project yet, a network of democracy centers in rural communities throughout America, where citizens could learn about their constitutional rights, access legal support for challenging government overreach, and connect with others who shared their commitment to democratic principles. The first center would be established in the renovated barn on Martha's farm, serving as a model for similar facilities that would preserve the spirit of citizen resistance for future generations. As the sun set over the Nebraska landscape that had shaped her entire life, Martha understood that her story was not ending, but evolving into something larger than any individual could achieve alone. The accidental discovery that had changed her life had become the foundation for a movement that would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by people who understood that freedom requires eternal vigilance and that democracy dies when good people choose silence over truth. If Martha's journey from struggling farmer to champion of constitutional democracy has inspired you, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what ordinary citizens can do to protect their democratic institutions. And if you believe these stories of courage and resistance need to be told, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because tomorrow we have another extraordinary tale of someone who refused to surrender their principles when powerful people demanded their silence. Your support helps us continue bringing you these untold stories of American heroes who prove that democracy's greatest strength lies not in its institutions, but in the courage of individual citizens who refuse to let freedom die on their watch.